My beloved child, something has shifted quietly in a place you were never allowed to enter, and the truth that remained hidden between you and the person your heart still recognizes is beginning to surface in a way no one expected. Listen closely, because this is not a story about blame, and it is not about reopening an old wound. It is about finally understanding why something that once felt so natural became strangely complicated almost overnight. There was a moment when you and your soulmate were moving toward each other with a simplicity that frightened people who did not understand the depth of that connection. You may remember it differently. Perhaps there were conversations that suddenly became shorter, plans that stopped being mentioned, warmth that slowly became hesitation, or a distance that appeared without any clear explanation. You probably asked yourself more than once what changed. Was it something you said? Something you failed to notice? Did their feelings simply disappear? But here is the first realization you need to hold gently. Sometimes two people can care deeply for one another and still become separated by pressures neither of them knows how to name. And somewhere behind the silence, someone knew much more than they ever admitted. Don't skip, because the confession was not what the family expected, and the most important part is not simply who spoke. It is why they stayed quiet for so long. For a long time, this person watched everything from a careful distance. They saw the way your soulmate changed whenever your name entered a conversation. They noticed how the atmosphere shifted whenever your future together was mentioned. And slowly, without anyone announcing it directly, opinions began forming around the relationship. Some were protective. Some were uncertain. Some were based on misunderstandings. No one woke up one morning intending to tear two people apart. That is what makes this truth more complicated. It happened through small conversations, cautious suggestions, unanswered questions, and assumptions that grew stronger because nobody challenged them. One person would say, maybe they're moving too quickly. Another would quietly wonder whether your lives were too different. Someone else would remind your soulmate of responsibilities, expectations, family traditions, old promises, or the kind of future everyone had already imagined for them. And your soulmate listened. Not because their heart had suddenly stopped caring, but because they were standing between what they felt and what they believed they were supposed to do. Can you see the difference? That distinction changes everything. There is a kind of distance that comes from losing feelings, and there is another kind that comes from becoming overwhelmed by conflicting loyalties. From the outside, they can look exactly the same. From the inside, they feel completely different. Your soulmate began carrying questions they did not know how to bring to you. They wondered whether loving you would disappoint people they had spent their entire life trying to please. They wondered whether choosing their own path meant rejecting the people who had shaped them. And because they did not know how to explain that inner conflict, silence became easier than honesty. That silence hurt you, even if they never intended it to. You felt the shift without receiving the explanation. You noticed the absence without knowing what had filled the space between you. You may even have blamed yourself for a decision that was being influenced by conversations you never heard. Stay till the end, because the confession that finally surfaced did not begin with an accusation. It began with regret. Someone close to the situation finally admitted that the family had been given an incomplete picture of you. Not a cruel picture. Not some dramatic fabrication. Something far more realistic happened. Fragments became conclusions. A small misunderstanding was repeated without context. A hesitation was interpreted as a lack of commitment. A quiet moment became evidence that perhaps you did not care enough. Something your soulmate once shared while confused was remembered as though it represented their permanent feelings. And little by little, people began responding not to who you actually were, but to a version of the story built from scattered pieces. Think about how powerful that can become. One unfinished sentence travels into another conversation. One concern gets repeated until it sounds like certainty. One person's fear becomes another person's warning. Eventually, everyone believes they are protecting someone, while nobody realizes they are protecting them from something that was never fully true. But there is another layer. The person who finally confessed had witnessed something the others had not. They had seen your soulmate after the separation. They saw how often your name still appeared in ordinary moments. They watched them become quiet when certain songs played, when familiar places were mentioned, when someone unknowingly repeated a phrase you used to say. Nothing theatrical happened. Life continued. People laughed. Days passed. Responsibilities were handled. Yet beneath all of that normality, something remained unfinished. And the person watching began to realize that the separation had not created the peace everyone expected. It had created questions. At first, they told themselves time would settle everything. Then weeks became months, and those questions did not disappear. Your soulmate tried to move forward emotionally, but there were moments when their honesty slipped through. I never explained it properly. They probably think I stopped caring. I wish they knew what was happening around me then. Those words were not spoken for an audience. They emerged quietly, usually when defenses were low. And someone remembered every one of them. Something important is waiting for you here, because this confession was not simply, we influenced the situation. It was more personal than that. The person finally admitted that there had been one conversation in particular that changed the direction of everything. Your soulmate had reached a point where they were considering standing firmly beside you. They had begun speaking differently. More confidently. They were thinking about making their own decision instead of asking everyone else what they should do. And then a family conversation took place. Nothing explosive. No dramatic confrontation. Just a room filled with people whose opinions mattered deeply to them. Concerns were raised. Questions were asked. Your soulmate was reminded of everything that could become complicated. And in that moment, instead of hearing, follow what feels true, they heard versions of, think carefully about what this could cost. Your soulmate walked away from that conversation believing distance might be the responsible choice. They thought perhaps stepping back would prevent conflict. Perhaps giving you space would eventually make things easier for everyone. Perhaps their feelings would become simpler if they stopped feeding them. But feelings do not always disappear because a person has decided they are inconvenient. Sometimes they become quieter. Sometimes they wait beneath the surface. Sometimes they return whenever the noise around them finally fades. And now the person who stayed silent has begun asking themselves a difficult question: what if they helped create a separation that neither of you truly wanted? That question became impossible to ignore when they discovered something else. Your soulmate had never spoken badly about you. Even during the confusion, even while people around them questioned the connection, your soulmate continued defending certain things about you. They would correct unfair assumptions. They would say, "That isn't what they meant." They would remind people of your kindness. They would explain details no one else understood. And this surprised the person who eventually confessed, because they realized something simple but powerful. If your soulmate truly wanted to erase you from their life, why were they still protecting your character when you were not even there to hear it? That realization changed the entire emotional meaning of what happened. The family had assumed distance meant certainty. In reality, distance had been filled with conflict. They thought your soulmate had peacefully accepted the separation. They had not seen the private moments of doubt. They had not heard every conversation. They did not realize how much had remained unsaid. And when the confession finally came, the family was forced to look at the past differently. Not with shame. Not with hostility. With surprise. Because several people suddenly understood that they had each been working with different pieces of the same story. Nobody had possessed the whole truth. Imagine a table covered with fragments of a photograph. Everyone looks at one piece and believes they understand the picture. Then someone finally places the pieces together, and the image is nothing like what they imagined. That is what began happening. A detail your soulmate had never told one family member was revealed. Another person admitted they had misunderstood something you once said. Someone remembered that an important conversation had happened during a stressful period, when emotions were already complicated. Suddenly, conclusions that once seemed solid began looking much less certain. And then came the moment no one expected. The person who had remained quiet admitted, "I think I pushed them away from someone they genuinely loved." The room changed. Not because everyone instantly agreed, but because honesty had finally entered a place where assumptions had been doing most of the talking. That sentence opened a door. Your soulmate was asked a question they had avoided for a long time: if nobody else's opinion mattered, what would you have chosen? Silence followed. A very different silence from the one that separated you. This silence was honest. Your soulmate did not rush to answer. They did not hide behind practicality. They simply looked down, gathered themselves, and finally said something that surprised the people around them: "I would have wanted us to figure it out together." Notice those words. Not everything would have been perfect. Not nothing could have gone wrong. Something far more mature. They would have wanted the chance to figure it out with you instead of deciding the ending without you. That is the rare realization hidden inside this confession. The deepest regret was not necessarily the distance itself. It was that you were never included in the conversation that created it. Decisions about your connection were shaped while you were absent. You never had the opportunity to answer the doubts, explain the misunderstandings, or simply say, "This is how I actually feel." And your soulmate is beginning to understand that too. Perhaps you needed this truth for reasons beyond reconciliation. Perhaps part of you simply needed to know that your intuition was not foolish when it sensed something unfinished. You were not imagining that sudden change. There really had been more happening beneath the surface than you could see. But hold this gently: understanding the past does not mean you must chase it. It does not mean you must force an outcome. Sometimes the most powerful thing a truth can give you is freedom from the wrong explanation. You can stop carrying responsibility for every unanswered question. You can recognize that other people's uncertainty played a role without turning them into villains. You can understand your soulmate's hesitation without pretending their silence did not affect you. Two truths can exist together. They may have cared deeply, and they may still have handled things imperfectly. The family may have believed they were helping, and their influence may still have created unintended distance. That is where maturity begins, not in choosing one person to blame, but in finally seeing the whole picture. Yet something has changed now that the confession is out. Conversations that once stopped whenever your name appeared are beginning to continue. Questions that once felt forbidden are being asked openly. Your soulmate is being invited to speak for themselves rather than letting everyone else interpret their feelings. And strangely, the person who once contributed to the distance may now become the very person who encourages honesty. They have realized that protecting someone does not always mean choosing for them. Sometimes it means trusting them enough to let them choose. There is one final detail, however, that has not yet been fully spoken aloud. It concerns the exact misunderstanding that convinced the family you and your soulmate could never make the relationship work. The person who confessed knows where that misunderstanding began. Your soulmate knows part of it. Another family member knows the rest. And when those pieces finally meet, someone is going to realize that one of the biggest reasons you were pulled apart was built around something neither of you actually believed. That is where the story changes direction. Because the confession was only the beginning. What no one understood was that the misunderstanding had started with a sentence that was never meant to carry so much weight. Your soulmate had once spoken during a moment of uncertainty, when emotions were tangled and the future felt difficult to picture clearly. They had said something simple. Something about not knowing whether the two of you were ready for everything that might come with choosing each other. But by the time those words traveled through the family, their meaning had changed. "I'm worried about whether we're ready," slowly became, "I don't think this relationship can work." And somewhere along the way, people stopped asking your soulmate what they actually meant. They simply began responding to the version they had heard. That version grew stronger each time it was repeated. One person became concerned. Another became protective. Someone else decided that perhaps distance would save everyone from future disappointment. And your soulmate, already overwhelmed, began hearing their own uncertainty reflected back to them as though it were certainty. Imagine how strange that must have felt, to express one temporary fear, only to have everyone around you treat it like your final decision. This is where the confession became even more revealing, because the person who finally spoke admitted they had been the first one to repeat that sentence without its full context. They had not intended to change the story. They believed they were simply explaining what your soulmate had said. But months later, they realized that one missing detail had altered everything. Your soulmate had also said, "I still want to try." Those words had never traveled with the rest of the conversation. Don't skip, because when that forgotten detail finally surfaced, the atmosphere changed immediately. For the first time, the family understood that your soulmate had never been asking for permission to leave you. They had been asking for reassurance that the two of you could survive the complications together. And instead of receiving reassurance, they received caution. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. Your soulmate began looking back at those days with new eyes. They remembered waiting for someone, anyone, to say, "Maybe you don't need all the answers yet. Maybe you can talk to them. Maybe you can work through this together." But those words never came. Instead, every concern seemed to confirm the next one, until stepping away began feeling like the safest choice. Yet safety and truth are not always the same thing. Sometimes the path that creates the least immediate tension leaves the deepest unanswered questions behind. That was what happened here. The distance reduced the conflict around your soulmate, but it did not resolve what existed inside them. In fact, something unexpected happened after you were pulled apart. Your soulmate began noticing how often they still mentally included you in their future. They would see something ordinary, a place, an idea, a small achievement, and instinctively imagine telling you. They would experience a moment of happiness and think about how you would react. They would make plans and quietly notice the space where your opinion used to belong. These were not dramatic moments. That is exactly why they mattered. Real attachment often reveals itself most clearly in the ordinary spaces where someone continues to exist even when they are no longer physically present. And the family began noticing this too. At first, they assumed it was simply habit. Then someone realized months had passed, yet your soulmate still spoke about certain memories with the same warmth. Another person noticed how quickly they defended you whenever someone made an unfair assumption. Someone else finally asked, "Why do you still protect them if you believe leaving was the right choice?" Your soulmate could not answer immediately. Not because they had nothing to say, but because the answer demanded a level of honesty they had avoided for a long time. Stay till the end, because this was the moment the confession stopped being about the past and started changing the present. Your soulmate eventually admitted something quiet: "I never stopped respecting them. I just thought everyone saw something I couldn't." Those words made the person who had confessed feel the full weight of what had happened. Your soulmate had trusted the people around them so deeply that they assumed the family's doubts must be based on wisdom they themselves were missing. They believed perhaps love had made them unable to see clearly. But now the family was discovering the opposite possibility. Perhaps their distance from the relationship had prevented them from seeing the things your soulmate understood instinctively. They had judged moments without living them. They had interpreted your silence without knowing what happened before it. They had viewed your differences as risks while your soulmate had often experienced those same differences as balance. Suddenly, the family began asking questions they should have asked much earlier. What did you actually bring into your soulmate's life? How did they feel when they were around you? Were they becoming smaller, or were they becoming more honest? Did your presence make them lose themselves, or did it encourage them to understand themselves more deeply? And slowly, answers began appearing through memories. Your soulmate remembered conversations where you challenged them gently instead of simply agreeing. They remembered moments when you noticed something was wrong even when they claimed everything was fine. They remembered how you could sit beside them without demanding constant explanation. They remembered laughing about things no one else understood. Those memories did not prove that everything between you was perfect. That was never the point. What they revealed was that the connection had contained something real enough to deserve a conversation instead of an assumption. Something important is waiting for you here. The confession did not magically solve everything. In fact, it created a new kind of uncertainty. Now that the family understood they might have influenced the separation more than they realized, what were they supposed to do with that truth? Should they encourage your soulmate to reach out? Should they remain quiet and let life decide? Should they apologize to you even though you had never known what happened behind the scenes? For the first time, the people who once believed they knew the right direction became hesitant. And strangely, your soulmate became calmer. The truth had removed a burden they had carried without realizing it. For so long, they had believed everyone around them was certain while they alone remained confused. Now they discovered that certainty had partly been built on incomplete information. That realization returned something important to them: permission to trust their own feelings again. Yet they did not immediately run toward you. That matters. Because genuine reflection is often quieter than impulsive action. Your soulmate began asking themselves what they would do differently if another conversation ever happened. Would they explain what they were feeling instead of disappearing into silence? Would they ask you questions instead of assuming your answers? Would they protect the connection from outside opinions without shutting their family out completely? Would they finally tell you the one thing they had been afraid to admit? That some of their distance had never been about wanting less of you, but about believing they were making life easier for everyone else? That question stayed with them. And then something happened that shifted the emotional balance even further. The person who confessed found an old message. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was something your soulmate had written during the weeks when the distance was beginning. They had never sent it to you. Perhaps they had typed it and saved it. Perhaps they had written it somewhere private simply to understand their own emotions. But the message contained a line that nobody in the family had ever heard. Your soulmate had written, "I wish I could explain why I'm stepping back without making them feel like they did something wrong." Suddenly, every assumption collapsed. Because if your soulmate truly believed you were the problem, why were they so worried about you blaming yourself? The confession had already changed the family's understanding, but this message changed something deeper. It showed that even while moving away, your soulmate had been thinking about the emotional impact on you. They knew you might interpret their distance personally. They knew silence could make you question your worth. And somewhere inside them, they regretted not having the courage to explain. The person who discovered the message asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Why didn't you send this? Your soulmate stared at those words for a long time. Then they gave an answer no one expected. Because if we talked, I wasn't sure I could walk away. Let that settle for a moment. Not because it guarantees what happens next. Not because it creates some perfect ending. But because it reveals the emotional truth beneath the separation. The distance had not necessarily been easy because the connection was weak. In some ways, the connection may have been exactly what made the distance difficult. Your soulmate had believed that continuing the conversation would pull them back toward you, and at the time, they were convinced stepping away was what everyone needed. Now they are questioning whether that belief was ever truly theirs. And this is where the story becomes surprisingly gentle. The family did not suddenly turn against one another. Nobody began pointing fingers. Instead, the person who confessed said something that softened the entire room: maybe we should stop deciding what their relationship means and let them decide for themselves. That sentence carried the lesson hidden beneath everything. Love cannot grow well when surrounded by constant interpretation. Two people eventually need space to speak honestly, make their own choices, and accept whatever those choices become. Your soulmate heard that sentence, and for the first time in a long while, they did not feel they had to defend you or defend the family. They simply felt free to think. And their thoughts went somewhere immediately. They went to the last real conversation the two of you had, the one that ended with so much unsaid. They remembered your expression. They remembered something you asked them. A question they never answered properly. Perhaps you had said, "Is this really what you want?" And maybe your soulmate responded with silence, avoidance, or something far less honest than what they were feeling. Now that question has returned with different weight. Because today, if you ask them the same thing, their answer might not be as simple. They have begun separating what they wanted from what they believed they should want. That process is changing them. But there is still one piece of the confession you have not heard. The part involving someone in the family who quietly disagreed with the separation from the very beginning. This person never spoke up because they believed it was not their place. They watched. They listened. They noticed what everyone else missed. And when the recent confession finally opened the door, they revealed something about your soulmate's behavior during those final days that made even the person who started the misunderstanding go completely quiet. Because your soulmate had done something privately, something that suggested they were never preparing to forget you at all.